Hello, and welcome to my Chapter 5 lecture from the textbook, The Lifespan on Human Development. This chapter will be on the emerging self and socialization in the early years. So, getting this started. Learning objectives. Explain theoretical views of the self system, including elements of self and factors that influence a child's perceptions of self. Describe phases on the continuum of early self-system development in the areas of pre-self, self-recognition, and self-regulation, and identify indicators or manifestations and influencing factors. Assess the effects of different parenting styles on a child's development, self-development, and suggest techniques for improving parenting skills to address targeted behaviors, and describe how parenting, child temperament, self-regulation, and internalization shape conscious formation in the beginnings of a moral self. So the self system, the use of the term self system to represent a multifaceted concept. It captures it, but it doesn't capture it, right? The self system is the system that is yourself. So there's the I self and the me self. The I self is self as subject, active agent, subjective self-awareness, self as knower and distinct from other persons. This emerges first, and you experience continuity in your I identity over time. Now, the me self is the self as object of others' observations, the part that is known, the material, social, spiritual attributes of the self. It involves self-esteem, your evaluation of these attributes, and the looking glass self, which is based on the reflection of others' appraisals. So how do I look in others' views? And the development of the self is definitely shaped by social influences. You know, if you're in an environment where you're constantly being built up and praised and told good job and I'm so proud of you, that's going to have an impact on your self-esteem, versus if you're in an environment where you're being told you suck and you're terrible and you're never going to amount to anything, you're never going to get out of this town, you're never going to whatever, that's going to affect your self-esteem and the way that you look at yourself as well. So early development of the self system, the pre-self develops in the first year and a half year of an infant's life. They see their self as separate from others and able to affect things. So they know that they can have effect on others and on objects. The I self starts to develop at age 12 months. There's agency, intentionality, planned behaviors, right? Goal-oriented behaviors. Attachment to caregiver prompts a sense of self-worth. So they receive self-worth from being able to be attached to a caregiver. So self-recognition is emergent self-awareness at ages 18 to 24 months. The me self is starting to emerge. There's early self-control, feelings of autonomy, and the self-monitoring self starts to emerge at 24 to 60 months. And this involves self-description and self-regulation. I pulled this from the cited article at the bottom. So Fur et al. Says that high quality relationships with teachers and peers in the classroom form the foundation for the development of students' academic engagement, achievement, and motivational resilience. This chapter offers teachers and researchers a motivational framework that explains the dynamics that sustain positive and negative relationships, and a set of tools for creating solutions to improve relationships. Motivational model based on self-determination theory posits that students develop close and supportive relationships when teachers and peers meet their fundamental needs for relatedness, competence, and autonomy in school through the provision of warmth and involvement, optimal structure, and autonomy support. Relationships are undermined when teachers and peers thwart students' basic needs through neglect or through interactions that are rejecting, chaotic, or coercive. This conceptualization provides teachers a set of tools they can use to diagnose and treat relationship problems in the classroom. Teachers can use their observations of students' disaffection to identify underlying motivational issues and shape their responses to disaffected students in many ways that are more likely to renew their intrinsic motivation. Awareness of these dynamics can help teachers identify and initiate interactions likely to lead students towards more satisfying relationships with their teachers and peers. So that's to say that even a teacher's relationship can play a role in the attachment that a child develops, right? So if they've got teachers that don't care, never involved, don't provide support, don't provide help, that can affect the way that a child attaches to people throughout their life. And then this is a model that kind of helps you to see what parts and pieces contribute to engagement, coping, competence, relatedness, all these different things. So if they've got warmth or rejection, structure versus chaos, autonomy, support versus coercion, those can affect autonomy, competence, and relatedness, which can affect engagement versus being disengaged or disaffection. It can involve coping and re-engagement versus lack of coping and lack of engagement, which will have an impact on their learning and achievement. So roots of self-regulation and executive function that helps inhibit impulses and behavior. So you can control when impulsive urges arise, right? You don't just immediately eat the candy. You don't immediately shout the answer. You don't immediately do whatever you're impulsively wanting to do. There's effortful control, capacity to delay gratification, willpower, and emotion and behavior regulation. Motion regulation begins to develop in context of caregiver relationship, and behavior regulation begins in second year of life, which is aided by objective self-recognition and representational thought. Self-conscious emotions are emerged by the end of the second year, which involve embarrassment, guilt, awareness, and awareness of others' judgments. So for early socialization, parenting, and the development of the self system, there is growing independence. Parents grant more autonomy to the child. They might be able to do things more themselves, or parents might afford them opportunities to do things more themselves, so grow in that autonomy and independence. Caregivers begin to socialize the child and impose discipline. There are certain dimensions you want to consider with the parenting style. Is there any warmth or control? Parent responsiveness and sensitivity is part of warmth, and it's preferable for a child to be the center of the attitude rather than being a parent-centered attitude. So be thinking about what the child wants and needs from you as a parent rather than what you want and need as a child. As for control, that involves parent demandingness, imposing discipline. It's preferable that you have clear boundaries and consistent behavioral control rather than being an inconsistent parent. You want to provide consistent structure, and that will give a child consistent boundaries within which they know they can function, right? So it's not psychological control, intrusiveness, or interference. It's not that kind of control. It's healthy control. And so with this information, you want to look at these things as they apply to a client that's sitting in front of you, right? Did their parents ever let them grow in independence, or do they have an enmeshed family system where their parents did everything for them? And perhaps they're in a phase of their life and now they're in a learned helplessness state. They don't know how to do their own dishes and they're 28. They don't know how to do laundry. They don't know how to do anything because somebody always did it for them. Or did they maybe have to start being an adult at a much younger age than would have been expected? Maybe at age 6, they're doing laundry and feeding themselves and cooking and cleaning because their parents are so absent, or the parents have addiction or mental health issues, right? So these different things can definitely be very helpful to know about your client. It can help you with healing unhealthy attachments. It can help you with helping them with their own parenting style. If maybe they're repeating things that their parents did and they're struggling to overcome them and stop them, helping them understand where it even comes from in the first place. Learned behavior from their caregivers can help them to have better control sometimes. There are 4 parenting styles, which I covered in the last set of slides for chapter 4: authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, and neglecting, uninvolved. And I gave y'all the image to understand that. So authoritative, highly responsive, highly demanding. You're promoting autonomy, supporting assertiveness, and showing affection. That's the healthy one that you want to go for. Authoritarian is the Hitler style, as I called it. You're low on responsiveness, highly demanding. They're restricted, they communicate less effective, and there's more psychological control. The because I said so parenting style. The permissive parent is moderately to highly responsive. They're low on demands of the children, though. They're neglecting and uninvolved. They're low on response. And then the neglecting and uninvolved parenting style is low on responsiveness and not demanding. They neglect responsibility to socialize the child. They don't meet the child's needs. They may use harsh techniques when they do impose limits. This is that parent that may not know where their kids are because they're just that uninvolved. And with parenting outcomes, so the authoritative parent has positive outcomes. The children can have high self-esteem. They have adaptability, competence, good social skills, peer acceptance. They're good at doing cost-benefit analysis, understanding the consequences of their behavior, and having good self-control. And then the authoritarian parenting style is associated with more negative outcomes, where a child will have low self-esteem, be anxious, conflicted, and lack self-regulation skills. The child of an authoritarian parent also may become a very good liar, because they know that if they were to get caught, they'll get really in trouble. So they may learn to be good liars in that parenting style, because they know that mom and dad won't be very accepting or very understanding. They're going to get, full whip from the whiplash, or full whiplash from the whip, if you will. Permissive parents, you've got more negative outcomes. Children are likely to be uncontrolled, impulsive, low self-reliance, low cognitive competence, and social agency. As I previously mentioned in the last set of slides, children of permissive parents and uninvolved neglecting parents are likely to have very poor habits. They might have health issues like obesity, poor dental hygiene, cavities. They might have bad grades, skip school, a lot of that kind of stuff, because the parents aren't involved, or they're just so permissive they don't enforce any kind of consequences for when children misbehave. For the neglecting uninvolved parent, negative outcomes are associated with that as well, involving impulsive behavior and high levels of externalizing and internalizing problems. So externalizing problems, blaming things on others that are actually their fault, and perhaps internalizing problems that aren't their fault. So they struggle to place the blame in the appropriate place. And that's actually a cognitive distortion called personalization, where you have difficulty putting the blame in the appropriate place. And there are many interacting factors that modify parent effects. So there is that image I showed you guys before. So you see the responsivity, high and low, versus demandingness, low and high, right? And the 4 types. Parenting practices, methods of control. So power assertion involving corporal punishment and threats, withdrawing privileges, timeout, withholding needs such as meals. This can be effective for immediate behavior control, but there are side effects of anger, anxiety, and it doesn't promote self-regulation. Psychological control, such as love withdrawal, expressing disappointment with the child, and cutting off verbal emotional contact, can generate high anxiety in the child and only will have short-term results. Induction involves use of explanation, reasons for rules, and other oriented reasoning. This promotes internalization of rules and adoption as their own principles. So you're helping them to understand why they can or cannot do certain things, instead of just saying, because I said so, because I'm the parent, because you're the child, I'm in charge, right? That doesn't help a child to understand the point of the rules or the point of the limits, but induction would do that. So overall, warm, responsive parenting generates compliance the best. Moderators of parenting and parenting effectiveness. There are multiple interacting causes that affect child outcomes. Multidimensional view says parenting, genetics, child temperament, and other factors contribute. There's an influence of children on parents and parenting. There is more directive parenting with a dependent child. There's more commanding or ignoring that is done with an aggressive child, right? They don't want to deal with it, perhaps. They don't want to hear about it. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to deal with that. So they might be more commanding, or actually just ignore them. Children's low levels of affection predict changes in parents' behaviors over time, right? So if a child doesn't show love and affection to their parent, the parent might care less about doing the parenting, perhaps. Other factors modifying behaviors of children and parents include the parent relationship history, attitudes, and mental state. And again, just bridging this back to the counseling session, the counseling environment, these are all things that can help you understand your teenagers' issues with their parents, or your children's issues with their parents, or a parent's issues with their children, that they're coming to see you because they're so stressed out by issues that they're having with their kiddos. This is all information you can use to empower a parent to use an authoritative style and a healthy parenting method with their kids to have good outcomes and good relationships. So children's differential susceptibility to parenting stages. So differential susceptibility based on child's temperament. A child with difficult temperament generally is more aggressive. Cultural structures and values, parenting, and child outcomes also play a role. So typically the African American home is authoritarian. They value individualism. European Americans are authoritative, value autonomy and individualism. Latino American tends to be authoritarian, patriarchal, and involves interdependence, which there are several kinds of independence. And actually, I will just add a new slide so you can see it. So types of dependence. So we've got codependence, which what is codependence? So that would be relying on something outside oneself, oneself to be okay. Right? So that could mean parents, relationship, oh my goodness, I can't type, substances, could even be a pet. And then there is dependence. What is that? That is a legitimate dependence on something outside of oneself to be okay, right? And what are examples of that? So that could mean someone that was just discharged from a psychiatric hospital, right? They are needing legitimate support, right? They need help with bathing, eating, clothing themselves, making sure they take their medication, right? They really depend on them because they're adjusting to stable mental health, right? Or someone that's got legitimate dependence would be somebody with cerebral palsy, right? Oh my goodness, I cannot spell today or type. Or even someone on the autism spectrum, right? They have a legitimate dependence on people around them. Now, what is independence? Being able to be okay on one's own, right? You can do everything yourself. And then what is interdependence? What is that? That's the whole reason I made this slide, right? So interdependence is mutual dependence with others, where you rely on others to help with things that you could do on your own. So you might be interdependent with mother and father raising kids, right? So maybe she's in charge of teaching them manners and saying please and thank you, and dad's in charge of discipline. Or you could be interdependent on someone to clean your home with another person. So that could look like I'll do the vacuuming and the windows, and you're going to do the weeds and whatever outside, right? So those are your different terms: codependence, dependence, independence, and interdependence, right? So jumping back a slide. So the Latino American family is authoritarian, patriarchal, and interdependence is valued. In Native American culture, the parenting style is typically permissive and interdependence is the value. And then Asian Americans are very authoritarian and value interdependence as well. Cultural normativeness moderates outcomes of discipline. Generally, corporal punishment promotes child aggression. So I think you can very well see how this would apply to counseling and just understanding the multicultural backgrounds that different clients can come from and the type of parenting that they experienced. And so if you know that someone comes from a family with a very permissive parenting style, right, Native American perhaps, you might see a connection between that and why that patient might be struggling with bullying. Perhaps they're very permissive, they don't stand up for themselves, right? So just more information to understand clients. And then conscience, the beginnings of a moral self. So parenting style correlates with child self-esteem and contributes to child self-regulation and approved social behaviors. So development of conscience, the conscience is associated with internalization and aspects of moral development. Parents' warmth, responsiveness facilitates compliance and promotes concerns with others. So child anxiety, emotional arousal affect willingness to comply and internalize standards. So The more anxiety a child has, the lower the likelihood to comply with standards that are set. And that very well could be because of being in survival mode. I don't feel safe enough to do what you tell me. I need to do something else in order to feel safe and feel okay. Perhaps they need to do some stimming, some stimulation in some way to help themselves to feel comfortable, but they don't want to listen to what you have to say because they want to make themselves feel better however they know how. So Kohlberg's theory of moral development, this wasn't in the slides, I added it. So step one, the pre-conventional, I'll zoom in a little bit here. So level one is the pre-conventional, younger than 6, a couple steps 1 and 2. Level 2 is the conventional level, ages 7 to 11. So steps 3 and 4. And then level 3 is post-conventional for steps 5 and 6. So step 1, punishment and obedience orientation. They obey rules to avoid punishment. In step 2, there's naive hedonism. So you conform to get rewards and have favors returned. Step 3, there's a good boy, good girl morality that develops, and they conform to avoid disapproval or dislike by others. And you can see how that plays into Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I don't know if you guys have ever learned about that to this point, but I will now add a slide to it. This presentation, because I realized I didn't put in here and I didn't realize I could have, but I will add it right now. But yeah, so Maslow's hierarchy of needs, just to give you guys that image, if you've never seen it before, adding it here. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a hierarchy of basic human needs. And one of the biggest needs that I see being unmet that brings people into counseling is belongingness and love needs. They're struggling with intimate relationships and friends and feelings of belonging. And the way this hierarchy works is that if you don't have the needs that are below the one above it, you can't get up to the upper level, right? So if I'm hungry and cold and tired, why would I be focusing on friendships, right? Like logically, it doesn't make any sense. So, looking at Kohlberg's theory of moral development, right? They're conforming to avoid disapproval or dislike by others. And this lends to psychosocial development in Erikson's model that we saw in the chapter 1 slides, where there's, I want to fit into the group, right? You see that adolescence years, you're entering in there, the ego identity versus role confusion, right? Do I know who I am or not? And that can start to develop towards the end of that conventional level. In step 4, you conform to avoid censure by authorities. You don't want to be controlled, so you just do what's said. So you don't lose privileges and whatever. And then steps 5 and 6, you conform to maintain community, an emphasis on individual rights and individual principles of consciousness or conscientiousness also develop. And here's the Maslow's hierarchy of needs again. And here is another depiction of Kohlberg's moral development model, but it's in a hierarchy as well. So zooming in a little bit just because it's a little fuzzy. So the pre-conventional stage, 3 to 7, moral reasoning based on reward and punishment. You've got avoiding punishment at the bottom. Self-interest is next. Conventional stage, 8 to 13, moral reasoning based on external ethics, good boy attitude, law and moral or order, morality. And then post-conventional adulthood is moral reasoning and based on personal ethics, where you make social contracts and you have principles that you abide by. So Cooley's theory of self-development, he's got the theory of the looking glass self. So self-perception is influenced by an individual's beliefs about how he or she is perceived by others, observations of how others react, and interpretations of how others react. So you look at yourself through others, right? And you can definitely see how this would apply to working with people in counseling, right? If they're codependent and rely on others to give them worth and value and meaning in their life, or their self-esteem is low and it's contingent upon whether other people give them praise, you can see how their self-development is following this Cooley theory, right? And that may be developed from a very unhealthy place, perhaps, but helping them to gain understanding of why they do it or where it's coming from, like I said before, can be helpful with instigating change. So Mead's stages of development, the self develops in 3 stages. The preparatory stage, play stage, and game stage. In the preparatory stage, child imitates the behaviors of others. In the play stage, the child begins to formulate role expectations like playing house and cops and robbers. And in the game stage, the child learns there are rules that specify a proper and correct relationship among players. Mead furthered Cooley's theory of the looking glass self. He stated that some people are more important to us than others. So significant others would be those people whose judgments are most important, to our self-concept, mother, father, grandparents, playmates, etc. And role taking is the process which allows us to take the viewpoint of another individual and then respond to ourselves from that imagined viewpoint, a cognitive process that permits us to play out scenes in our mind. So it's kind of like forethought, role taking. What would it be like if I was to do that or be that person, right? You can see how that ties into empathy. Parents' discipline and child arousal. So discipline causes a child to feel anxious arousal. Minimum sufficiency principle is at play there, where you elicit only mild arousal. Child pays attention, tries to remember, comply, and internalize the rule. Anxious arousal from discipline elicits fear. Child is attentive to own hurt feelings, not to the rule or to the standard. So they're less likely to internalize and learn from it if they're really scared. If they're really afraid, they're less likely to internalize it, and they're more focused on how they feel than the lesson that they learned, if that makes sense. And then child temperament influences level of anxiety aroused as well. Fearful children respond best to gentle discipline, and the fearless child, warmth of a relationship to the parent is the biggest determinant of compliance. Applications, you're building through the self through attachment relationship. A secure child sees the self as valuable and loved. The insecure avoidant child may develop compulsive self-sufficiency, and the insecure anxious child feels ineffective in communicating needs. They might use coercion and or disarming manipulation. That's what that lying was that I was talking about. So you want to be careful about that. Parent training uses these skills to improve child behavior and gives clear directives. Don't turn commands into questions. Reinforce good behavior. Don't use criticism, sarcasm, yelling, or threats. Ignore minor misbehavior. Just redirect their attention, redirect the behavior. Use clear consequences sparingly, only as needed. And parent training based on theoretical principles is important. And you can see the parenting pyramid that is in your textbook. Applications. What about spanking? There's a blurred line between corporal punishment and abuse. Researchers and professional groups recognize that there's harm in spanking. Research shows that there are detrimental outcomes on 13 domains. So low moral internalization, child aggression, antisocial behaviors, externalizing and internalizing behavior problems, mental health problems and low self-esteem, negative parent-child relationship, impaired cognitive ability, and later as an adult, physical abuse, antisocial behavior, mental health problems, and low self-esteem. And also relevant to locus of control. It's not on here, but it's internalizing, externalizing things. So if I have an internal locus of control, I would believe that I have control over my life and my world, and I can influence it to be different or better or change somehow. Versus if I have an external locus of control, I might believe that I'm subject to the whims of the universe and I have no control over my life, and whatever happens to me happens to me. And so that could definitely be something that could be affected by an attachment style, right? Because if I feel like I'm powerless and I don't think I can do anything to change my life, why would I try? Right? So locus of control is something that could very likely be affected by a corporal punishment, abuse, neglect, poor attachment style with a client. And then parenting, the goal is to provide experiences for growth of mastery, autonomy, and self-efficacy. Let's end the slides now for some questions. I'm almost done. So chapter 5 questions. Babies don't enter the world with a concept of self. Which of the following is an early indication that a young child's self-awareness is emerging? The pre-self, self-recognition, social referencing, or secure attachment. Which one is it? Self-recognition. After young children show signs of self-recognition, they exhibit self-evaluation. This evaluative aspect of self is distinctly identified by which of the following terms? Self-concept, self-regulation, self-esteem, self-identity. Self-esteem. Children who are conflicted and exhibit both anger and anxiety have low self-esteem, show compliance with authorities, though perhaps a lack of self-regulation, and display poor social skills are likely receiving what type of parenting? Neglecting, uninvolved, authoritative, authoritarian, or child-centered? Which one would it be? A, B, C, or D? Authoritarian, right? Which cultural groups' value orientation and traditional values influence parenting to be permissive and maintain patriarchal as well as matriarchal structures? Asian, African, Latino, or Native American? Native American? Which of the following is most likely to affect compliance with fearless children? Warmth of the relationship to the parent, gentle discipline, harsh discipline, or intensity of the parent's power assertion? Warmth of their relationship to the parent. So Becky is struggling to learn her alphabet letters. Her kindergarten teacher, frustrated by failed attempts to teach her, says to Becky, "All the other girls and boys can write most of the letters and you can't even say their names." The teacher believes she is motivating the child to work harder by comparing Becky to others. Which of the following predictions is most consistent with Cooley's theory of self-development? Becky will develop a sense of agency because she is more motivated to compete with her peers. Becky will not develop a sense of agency because she is not given adequate support. Becky will work harder to develop her sense of self-esteem, or Becky will incorporate her teacher's negative evaluations into her construction of her own sense of self. Which one is it? It is D. She'll incorporate it into her own construction of herself. A counselor is leading a parents group when the topic of spanking as a disciplinary technique is raised. Based on research, what is the most accurate statement the counselor can offer? A, spanking is one of a variety of effective techniques for teaching pro-social skills to children. B, spanking should be used with young children for potentially dangerous kinds of misbehavior, like running across the street, because it is the only thing they understand under the circumstances. Spanking is the best way to discipline young children, but only when it's accompanied by a hug or some show of affection afterward. Or D, spanking may gain immediate compliance, but it does not aid development of self-regulation and may increase a child's aggressiveness. Which one is it? D. Might get you some immediate response, but it may lead to increased aggressiveness and poor development of self-regulation. And the last question, based on Crittenden's view, infants who have avoidant attachment classifications actively avoid or block out perceptions that arouse their feelings because they have experienced which pattern of learning or conditioning? A, intermittent reinforcement for displays of emotion. B, intermittent punishment for displays of emotion. C, predictable reinforcement for displays of emotion. Or D, predictable punishment for displays of emotion. Which one is it? D, predictable punishment for displays of emotion. All right, that is the end of the chapter 5 lecture. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day or night. Thank you.